Picture this. It's July 2026. The entire world is watching the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey. Global volatility is at an absolute peak, right? And absolute unity is required from every single member state. But for the Czech Republic, there's this wildly unprecedented scenario unfolding completely behind closed doors. They have one official seat at the table, but two leaders actively fighting over who actually gets to sit in it. So let's dive right into this explainer and see how an incredibly localized domestic squabble cascaded into a full-blown constitutional crisis with some very severe international security implications. Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the 2026 NATO summit crisis itself. 2. The Turek Affair escalation. 3. A constitutional tug-of-war. 4. Failing the NATO mandate. 5. A broader European trend. And finally, number 6, the fragility of unwritten rules. All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the 2026 NATO summit crisis and this fractured executive in Ankara. Now, the pressure at this specific NATO gathering literally cannot be overstated, which is exactly what makes this fracture so profound. Just take a look at the stark contrast between the two men at the center of this dispute. On one side, we have President Petr Pavel. He's heavily pro-Western, a staunch Atlanticist, and notably, the former chairman of the NATO Military Committee itself. On the flip side, we have Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. He recently returned to power, embracing a much more populist rhetoric and leading a coalition government that actually includes right-wing Eurosceptic parties. So you can see these two represent diametric opposites in the Czech political landscape, and their severe institutional conflict came to a head over one question: who officially leads the Czech delegation to NATO? Here's where things escalated. The Babiš government passed a formal resolution attempting to explicitly exclude President Pavel from the Ankara summit. This was a massive shock. Why? Because it completely shattered a 25-year unwritten convention. Ever since the Czech Republic joined NATO back in 1999, the president has almost universally led the delegation. So, in response, President Pavel filed what is known as a competence complaint. Essentially, he bypassed political negotiation altogether and went straight to the Constitutional Court, forcing the judiciary to intervene in a very high-level executive standoff. Which brings us to Section 2. The Turek Affair escalation, a true domestic catalyst. To really understand this international standoff, we actually have to zoom in on a very specific domestic dispute. It's the butterfly effect in action. The spark that ignited this entire crisis is widely known as the Turek Affair. In December 2025, operating completely under his constitutional authority to vet cabinet members, President Pavel formally refused to appoint a man named Filip Turek to the position of Minister of the Environment. Turek was a nominee from the junior coalition Motorist Party. Pavel pointed to Turek's well-documented history of publishing racist and homophobic posts on social media, basically arguing that this behavior was entirely incompatible with democratic values. Well, as you might guess, this rejection infuriated the junior members of the governing coalition, and this brings us to a remarkable bit of human drama. Foreign Minister Petr Pavel actually sent a series of late-night text messages to one of the president's senior advisors. Pavel explicitly warned that there would be serious consequences if Turek's nomination wasn't reconsidered. President Pavel didn't back down. He released these texts, accused the foreign minister of political blackmail, and actually referred the whole thing to the police. Pavel immediately retaliated on the diplomatic front. He declared his ministry would simply ignore the president in international affairs moving forward and officially suggested that Prime Minister Babiš should lead the NATO delegation instead. Notice the sheer speed of this crisis when you look at the timeline. It's like a political pressure cooker. In just 6 months, we go from an election to a rejected cabinet appointee to late-night blackmail texts to a formal diplomatic blockade, right up to an emergency court injunction just days before a major global security summit. The prime minister, who really needed to maintain his fragile parliamentary majority, decided to back his foreign minister's aggressive play to exclude the president. Moving right along to Section 3, a constitutional tug-of-war, or as I like to call it, the glitch in the matrix. Let's look at the actual structural bug in the Czech system that allowed this retaliatory ban to happen in the first place. It all boils down to one incredibly fundamental question: who legally represents the state? Now, you'd think this would be clearly spelled out, right? But the Czech framers actually left this intentionally ambiguous in the Constitution. They were hoping to force collaboration and rely on gentlemen's agreements between the presidency and the government. And that ambiguity builds a severe legal paradox. We literally have two overlapping, contradictory articles. Article 63 says the president represents the state externally and is the supreme commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That sounds absolutely perfect for a military alliance summit, right? But then Article 67 says the government is the highest body of executive power. To make things even more complicated, any presidential decisions in foreign affairs actually require the prime minister's countersignature to be legally valid. It's this exact ambiguity that fuels the competing claims from both sides. Because the government formalized the president's exclusion just 4 days before the NATO accreditation deadline, a standard legal trial was just impossible. The clock was ticking. So on June 24, 2026, the Constitutional Court executed a remarkably swift judicial maneuver. They issued a preliminary injunction strictly ordering the government to formally accredit President Pavel and basically not stand in his way. So here is the absolutely crucial point you need to take away from this. While this injunction gave President Pavel his seat in Ankara, the crisis itself is far from over. This injunction merely preserved the historical convention for this specific summit. It did not answer the core constitutional question. That deep structural crisis regarding executive authority remains entirely unresolved, and we are still pending a full merit judgment from the court later on. Okay, Section 4, failing the NATO mandate and the real-world danger of all this. Because beyond the legal drama, there is a very real-world danger here, rooted in substantive policy differences. Look at this number, 1.78. This is a critical figure on the global stage right now. It represents the percentage of GDP the Czech Republic is spending on defense in 2026, and it is notably below the mandatory 2% benchmark that is required of all NATO member states. This 1.78% figure is really at the heart of their fiscal dispute. Prime Minister Babiš recently cut planned defense spending by 21 billion Czech koruna. His main argument? The government desperately needs to fund domestic energy subsidies to help citizens with the rising cost of living. And because the cabinet drafts the budget, Babiš argues that only the government is truly qualified to lead the NATO delegation regarding these complex economic commitments. President Pavel, conversely, argues that missing that 2% target severely degrades the nation's security credibility. He's warning that the country is becoming a laggard in the alliance during a time of existential threat to the continent. And we're seeing this institutional friction bleed directly into policies regarding Ukraine. President Pavel is a highly vocal champion for arming Kyiv. During a visit, he actually promised to transfer a 4 Czech L-159 combat aircraft for Ukrainian air defense. But the Babiš government, pushed by its Eurosceptic coalition partners, immediately intervened and blocked that aircraft transfer. Furthermore, the government suspended all financial contributions to a highly successful international munitions initiative. So we're seeing a profound, tangible shift away from the previous pro-Ukrainian consensus. Section 5. A broader European trend. Let's look at the warning signs. We really need to look outside the Czech borders for a second, because this type of systemic vulnerability is actually showing up across dual executive democracies all over Europe. The classic stabilizing model is France back in 1986. A socialist president and a conservative prime minister managed their differences at the G7 summit through unwritten political decorum. They basically both attended and shared the duties. But then look at Poland in 2024, facing deep institutional paralysis over diplomatic appointments. And perhaps most alarmingly, we have to look at the Romanian precedent from 2012. In 2012, Romania faced the exact same dispute over who attends a European Council summit. The Constitutional Court there ruled decisively that the president possessed the mandate. However, in a completely shocking breach of norms, Prime Minister Victor Ponta brazenly ignored the highest court's ruling. He literally used emergency powers to delay the publication of the verdict and attended the summit anyway. It caused severe diplomatic fallout with the EU. This is a glaring red flag for what happens when political actors prioritize a partisan victory over the rule of law. Finally, Section 6, the fragility of unwritten rules. Let's conclude. The Czech Constitutional Court still has to issue its final merit judgment, and there are a few ways this could go. If they validate the president, they cement historical convention and really strengthen the presidency. If they prioritize the government, they essentially make the president's diplomatic role purely ceremonial moving forward. If they urge negotiation, the friction just continues. But honestly, the scariest, most dangerous scenario is the last one: protracted institutional paralysis, where retaliatory actions completely freeze the administrative apparatus of the state. And that leaves us with this final provocative thought to close out our explainer today. The Czech Constitution was purposely designed to force compromise. But what actually happens when the survival of a democracy and a nation's global security standing relies entirely on unwritten gentlemen's agreements, in an era where, let's face it, politics is more polarized than ever? It is a huge question, not just for Prague, but for democracies around the world. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.